Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of GCTV, this time live from the Garfield Center for the Arts. Where's the button to turn on my video? And there we are. Whoop, nope. Come on. There we go. Hello. Where's my face? There's my face. Hi. Welcome to another episode of GCTV. I'm your host, Nic Carter. I am live this week from the Garfield Center for the Arts. I'll explain why in a little bit. But before we get to all of that, I would like to remind you all that if you're enjoying what you see here this evening and would like to see more quality content like this, we ask that you please consider donating to the Garfield Center for the Arts by visiting garfieldcenter.org/donate/. Don't know why the second slash is there, but it's on the paper that I usually read that I don't have with me today, so I say it anyways. So yeah, this week we have a lovely weather out, and it has taken away the power at my apartment. So I'm here because the power's on here. And you know what they say, the show must go on. So this week we have a panel discussion that is a partnership with Chestertown RiverArts about Hamilton. Never heard of it. Just kidding. But so I'm not going to say too much else. I'm going to play you a quick video and we're going to get right into it. So thanks for joining.
I remember I started acting here more than 30 years ago through Actors Community Theater, and then we found our permanent home at the Garfield. And we've put on concerts, we've put on plays, we've put on musicals. People have been able to see their friends,
A friend said something to me that I hadn't considered, but made perfect sense. He said that of all of the towns on the Eastern Shore, if you are an artist or an intellectual or anything related to that, you have a home more than anywhere else in Chestertown.
So it's always been my key bucket list thing to have a theater that was mine and a place that I could go and be a part of theater on a daily basis. And when I found the Garfield, that's exactly what I found. A place that I fit in, a place that I could really be myself and expand myself within the confines of this wonderful space.
The Garfield Center for the Arts has shown me a side of myself that I didn't know existed and introduced me to a side of Kent County and a whole community of people who I probably wouldn't have known otherwise. So when I think about what the theater means to me, that's pretty huge. And so I hope that we will all do our part in whatever way you can right now to support the theater, whether you can do it financially, whether you can do it physically, whether you can do it just by helping spread the word of mouth, because eventually things will return to normal, and we want great local institutions like our community theaters to be there for us so that they can continue to help show us the best parts of ourselves and of our community.
Welcome to Talk Hamilton, a collaboration between the Garfield Center for the Arts and Chestertown RiverArts. As premier community arts organizations in Chestertown, both of us are supported by the Kent Cultural Alliance and the Maryland State Arts Council, and we're excited to work together this evening to provide interesting and fun content to engage our community in these unprecedented times. In 2015, Hamilton, an American musical, opened on Broadway. The show, like its reputation, grew as a force to be reckoned with in social, cultural, and even political arenas. With the show's recent arrival on Disney Plus on July 3rd, it suddenly found renewed interest and more fans. We are live on Facebook tonight, and this format allows viewers to participate via comments in the chat. You can share thoughts, ask questions, we'll monitor those, and we'll be able to put those questions to our panelists. I'm Ann Farley, I'm with RiverArts, and I'll be moderating our discussion this evening. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Steve Arnold, who is the Garfield's Executive Director. He's an experienced theater professional, an actor, director, administrator, and produced playwright, and he loves the music and the style of Hamilton. We also have Mariah Wood, who is RiverArts Executive Director. She wrote her honors thesis at Smith College on the social, cultural, and political resonances of Hamilton. And we have Natalie Lane, who is Kent County Public Library's Youth Services Librarian. She's active in many local theater projects and has been a fan of Hamilton since she has seen the show on stage 2 years ago. And so we're going to start tonight with the discussion about the appreciation and kind of critique of the film as a theatrical experience and as a film. And Natalie, as an actor, would you be willing to get us started and talk about your thoughts on this subject?
Absolutely. So when I first heard the music of Hamilton, as a performer, the first thing that came to my mind was, how are they going to accomplish some of these scenes that were clearly happening in the lyrics of the music? For example, I tried to imagine Alexander Hamilton's death at the end of the musical. How would they show the trajectory of that gunshot? What would that look like on stage? How would performers be able to create that choreography? Or even the famous rewind scene that Angelica sings, turning back time in the middle of a song as a scene is happening. How do we build that on stage and make it feel real? And once I finally got to see it happen on stage, it's just an incredible piece of work. As a performer, we are in constant motion. There are scene changes, but in Hamilton, it's almost to a different level. The set is built around the performers. There's not really much in the way of props or scene changes that happen in a blackout. Everything is happening seamlessly, simultaneously as one scene ends and the next one begins. People are moving themselves and the story along with that giant platform in the middle of the stage, which serves to progress the plot in time and for the actors to move around. It's pretty impressive. The unique feel of Hamilton and being really modern in a hip hop delivery. There's so much language in these songs. Just the feat of memorizing all of that and being able to deliver it on time at each performance is daunting. Additionally, this modern music juxtaposed with a very much historical moment in time, there has to be a balance to that. In the costuming itself, there's incredible choices being made by keeping everything from the neck up really modern, like in hairstyles and makeup, and everything else is period appropriate, but it also has, modern fabric so that the ensemble can move and dance and choreograph as they need to. There are so many elements that go into this show as a production that you don't really think about necessarily when you're watching, but for a performer, it's a really special experience to see.
If I could sort of jump in and kind of roll with what you just said, there is a certain kind of maybe tradition, history that wow, has its roots way, way, way back. Commedia dell'arte, Shakespeare. I mean, the idea of suggesting a moment or a scenery or a space, and even then drawing upon the audience's imagination to fill in the blanks, really has roots in some of the earliest theater. And it is played out in unique ways. And I think that one of the things that I can appreciate in any sort of new groundbreaking musical is whenever a piece finds a way to do that in kind of a unique or an interesting new way. Certainly, I think that what you suggested about showing a historical era on stage visually, but mixing it with contemporary themes, style, and performance, just sort of creates this universality of how that some of the themes and some of the ideas of what they're playing within that show can translate to modern times. But specifically, like, I want to say, like, take one moment, and that is the bullet, the dancer who represents the bullet. To turn that into an item that is embodied through choreography and through a single performer, it kind of reminded me. There was a show I saw years back. I'm a huge fan of the soundtrack. A guy named Adam Gettle, who wrote a play that was at Lincoln Center called A Light on the Piazza. Before he wrote that play, he wrote a show called Floyd Collins. And Floyd Collins was the first time that a show on stage used looping as a means by which to tell its story, because essentially it puts the story of Floyd Collins, who was trying to, during the Depression era, do better for his family. He went out to find a great cave in the Kentucky hills that he could build a business around for tourism and that sort of things. And when he discovers the cave, he stands on the precipice of it, and he throws his voice out, and it comes back to him. And then he keeps throwing out new sounds and new musical strings to that piece that also comes back until he's literally built this orchestra of just his own voice. And that's this amazing marriage between technology and storytelling, where it's relying on the audience to fill in the blanks. Thornton Wilder did it way back with Our Town. He didn't put any props in the hands. And nowadays we've got every one of these little spaces in Hamilton being imagined by what the actors are doing and what the words are being said, to sort of let the audience do the rest of that work. And I think they're happily involved in that process.
Yeah, and I would say that also, as a former stage manager, I'm so aware of how quickly this show moves, and how, once it starts, it does not stop until you get to the end 2.5 hours later. And to have tried to be a little bit more sort of concrete and realistic with props and set pieces and even costume pieces would have been absolutely undoable. And so to be able to keep the show moving, because it's so full of language, it's so full of movement, it's so full of music, that it really doesn't have room for a lot of those physical pieces that some performances have. So I really appreciate how well it tells the story through, not having those elements instead of adding them. I think it's amazing.
Each of you have given a good introduction here, and if there's anybody watching who hasn't had a chance to see the film yet, this might be a great time for us to show a clip. We have a video clip of the end of the Hamilton performance from the 70th Annual Tony Awards in 2016, and this will give our viewers a little sense of all of the different things the three of you have touched on.
We gotta go, gotta get the job done, gotta start a new nation, gotta meet my son, take the bullets out your gun, the bullets out your gun. We move undercover and we move as one. Through the night we have one shot to live another day. We cannot let a stray gunshot give us a weapon. We will fight up close, seize the moment and stay in it. It's either that or meet the business end of a bayonet. Code word is Rochambeau, dig me. You have your orders now, commando. So the American experiment begins, with my friends all scattered to the winds. Lawrence is in South Carolina, redefining bravery. We'll never be free until we end slavery. When we finally drive the British away, Lafayette liberty and I am loving it. See, that's what happens when you up against the ruffians. We in the shit. Somebody's gotta shovel it. Hercules mulligan. I need no introduction. When you knock me down, I get the back up again. Stands on a parapet.
We lower our guns as he frantically waves their white handkerchief.
And just like that, it's over. We tend to our wounded, we count our dead. Black and white soldiers wonder alike if this really means freedom. Not yet. We negotiate the terms of surrender. I see George Washington smile. We escort their men out of Yorktown. They stagger home single file. Tens of thousands of people flood the streets. There are screams and church bells ringing. And as our fallen foes retreat, I hear the drinking song they're singing. The world's turned upside down. 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 Freedom for America, freedom for France. Gotta start a new nation, gotta meet my son. We won, black, we won, we won. The world's turned upside
I'm wondering if each of you has a particular character or song that particularly interests you in the show that you'd like to talk about. Or you can just...
Do you mind if I jump in real quick and just say something about that clip that we just watched? Because
Yes, please
I
do.
just love that song so much. And that clip was from the Tonys in 2016 when Hamilton won all the Tonys you can win practically. And that happened to be the same day as the Pulse nightclub shooting. And so we were just talking about how there are no props in the show, but there are some props. And normally in that piece, they have muskets in their hands, but they re-choreographed in the morning so that they would not have muskets in their hands as a statement about gun violence and because I think they felt, you know, it would be difficult to watch and to do that performance on that day with prop guns. So that's a really interesting kind of combination of the props, no props question. I mean, it works perfectly well without them. And also the way that Hamilton has really intersected with the world outside of the theater throughout its time. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just really wanted to mention that.
And that's great. Those ties to the world outside are really interesting. So, you know, feel free to build on or talk about favorite parts.
I think if I had to pick a favorite character for me, I just feel so much tenderness for Eliza as a character. She gets such a raw deal in her personal life, you know, with her husband, with losing her child. But in the end, you know, she survives it all and she lives on and continues to do the work that she feels is necessary in the world. And I can't imagine having such limited choices in that era as a woman and facing all of these hardships and obstacles and still continuing on. It's impressive.
I really felt when I watched the film, I was surprised because to me in the film, all of a sudden it was all about Eliza. I felt like it was really from even the beginning. I mean, I knew the end, but even from her first moments, I felt like it was her show in some ways, which hadn't ever come across to me before.
I am kind of impressed with how they told Burr's story in the show, and I'm kind of intrigued by it because you know, if there is a villain in this story, it is Aaron Burr. But traditionally, villains are sort of given, they're underdeveloped. They're sort of given short shift as far as a good, reasonable understanding or an explanation for them. Years and years ago, when I was still in my sort of acting phase and doing a lot of work there, I played the role of Judd in Oklahoma one time. And the director, I don't have any idea what inspired this decision, had decided at some point that she was going to cut Lonely Room. Lonely Room, of course, is the one moment in the play where we actually get inside of Judd Fry's head and we understand that there is more motivation behind this guy's understanding about life and his place in it than it appears otherwise. Because otherwise, he's just basically a thug who just, tries to kill people. But with Lonely Room, we understand that he's down on his luck. He's had a difficult time. He's just trying to find someone that he can love, who can love him back and accept him for who he is. Without Lonely Room, you don't have that at all. So flash forward to watching Hamilton, and I'm thinking about Burr, and I'm thinking, okay, so even as recent as something like, say, Rent, where Benny is sort of traditional villain. We don't really get to know his motivation other than money and greed and that sort of thing. But in Hamilton, we learn about Burr, we understand Burr, and we ultimately have to realize that the distinction of what makes him a villain is a character flaw. And boy, what a weird and interesting way to tell a story in that regard. So when we get to a song like Wait For It, where we get a really decent insight into the huge personality difference there is between himself and Hamilton, and how that ultimately sets up this rivalry that isn't necessarily anyone's fault. They just have a way different idea about how to be a statesman or how to go after what they're trying to accomplish. Then we suddenly realize, okay, so if this guy's a villain, how do I process all this? So I am way fascinated with Burr. I especially like Wait For It, specifically for that reason. It just tells that story in such a unique way.
Yeah, I don't think I could find a favorite character, but what I think is, so brilliant and interesting about the way that the show is built. I know I just said that when I saw the film, I felt like it was Eliza's show, but in many ways, it's also Burr's show, and it's also the relationship between Burr and Hamilton. And I just love it in the second act when they start to, kind of try to take on each other's traits and emulate each other, and it just doesn't work. And it's such a interesting way to look at sort of human character and how we're all who we are, and you can't try to be somebody else or it's not going to work for you. So to be able to lay all that on top of these historical figures is really, incredible. And to me, that's why it's such great theater, because it tells us something about ourselves as well as about the history.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot written lately about the ending and Eliza, who we've talked about, and the gasp that she has at the end of the show. And we got a question about that. And I'm wondering if each of you would like to, or any one of you would like to speak to that, and maybe how what you saw on stage differed from what you pictured in your head.
Well, it's not on the cast recording, so I didn't picture it in my head. I'd love to hear what Natalie has to say.
So when I saw Eliza's gasp in the video production, I don't know that I remembered it from the stage production or that it stood out to me, but it was so prominent in the film version that it's inescapable. And I've seen a lot of different interpretations, but I think the one that speaks to me is her becoming self-aware that mission of telling the story has been accomplished. Here she is. Everyone's in the room with her and is listening to her story.
I think I'm with you on that. I feel like I almost feel like the gasp is just a recognition of the audience, and the audience tells her that it's like the complete breakdown of the fourth wall. It's, wow, there are people watching this story, and that this theme of why they're telling this story and how history is going to teach them, all of that has basically come true, and it's a recognition of that particular success. So yeah, I'm totally with you on that.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think, go ahead.
I mean, it's an interesting controversy. Like, there's also been a lot of discussion about the history in the show, and whether it's accurate or not, and whether it is that good. But with any piece of art that's based on a true story or inspired by real events, what its main objective, at least in my mind, as someone who has worked with youth and education for a long time, is to spark that interest, to dig deeper, to find more, to find the truth. And this show, if nothing else, creates so much conversation in either direction.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Natalie, you've given us the perfect transition to our next topic. We wanted to talk a little bit about historical accuracy and all of the things we've been each seeing and reading, and from the time we learned about Hamilton and maybe saw it on stage to now more and more people seeing it and discussing it on social media after seeing the video production. And there are historical inaccuracies, and we'd like to talk about maybe what some of them are, but maybe more importantly, is this important, and how do they affect the overall theatrical event? And Mariah, your scholarship was on Hamilton and these different influences, and so would you mind speaking a little bit to the history and then the representation of accuracy?
Sure. I'm not a historian, and I'm not an expert even in Hamilton's real history, but I tend to fall on the side of, maybe because of my theater background, the important thing when you're making a piece of theater is to make a piece of theater that people want to see and that accomplishes, the goal of showing people something that maybe reveals something to them about themselves, about the world. And so the details are kind of details. Now, of course, a historian's job is to know the real history and to interpret that. But I know that there has been a lot of discomfort with whether the facts as laid out on stage are accurate, and in many cases they're not. One great example is the fact that Angelica was actually already married when she met Hamilton, and this kind of love triangle that gets set up on the stage may have some basis in fact in terms of the fact that Hamilton and Angelica certainly had a close friendship. There's some speculation that they could have had some kind of flirtatious relationship or whatever, but whether she was married and gave up her chance at being with Hamilton for her sister or not is not as important as the fact that we're seeing this incredibly smart, strong woman on stage who is not only friends with Hamilton but friends with Jefferson, and she's telling him she's going to tell him to include women in the sequel, and that is what touches us, right? This presentation of this character that we can relate to and admire and kind of root for. So the details are less important in my mind, but they're still interesting, and I know a lot of people have questions about what's real, what's not real, and what's really drawn from history. Miranda did really work with historians in making the show. We worked with a lot of primary source documents, and I think what he has said is that they did the best they could to stay within the realm of history, except when they had to leave it in order to make a show that works. You've got to have an arc, a dramatic arc. You've got to have, you got to fit it all into 2 hours and 45 minutes on the stage. And so you can't expect to, I don't have a copy of the biography by Ron Chernow that the show is based on, but it's about that thick. So you couldn't put that in one show. particularly not one that people would want to come and see. So I would love to answer any questions that people have about specifics, but to me it works the way it is, and that's the important thing, because it's a piece of art, it's not a piece of history.
There is one sort of thing I'd like to add about what you're talking about, telling a story dramatically and how that might sort of affect an accurate retelling. Years ago, I directed a production of the Will Rogers Follies, which is pretty much a very reasonable biography of him. But it's the catch of the show, the little hook, is that it is a telling of the biography of Will Rogers as if it is being staged as a Florenz Ziegfeld extravaganza. So every once in a while, the voice of God, or in this case, Florenz Ziegfeld, will come in over the loudspeaker while the characters are up there performing their lives, essentially telling the story of their life on stage. And the voice of Florenz Ziegfeld will say, nope, let's move this along. We don't really care about that part. We're going to go right to the wedding. Well, why? No, he says we're going to move the wedding to the end of the act because the wedding always ends the act. So they have to wait to have their wedding when they would have normally had it in the biography story, just because now it tells a better story. So it's a really interesting way of sort of encapsulating exactly what you're talking about here, in that telling the story in an entertaining way makes you sometimes have to take liberties in how you tell it.
I thought it was interesting this year, the high schoolers who take advanced placement tests for the AP US History, they actually had Lin-Manuel Miranda do a study session. And it was so much fun to sit through it and listen to him talk and basically tell the students, if this has gotten you excited to learn about history, then that was my goal. And not everything's going to be accurate. It's up to you to dig into the primary sources and figure it out. But I've gotten you thinking about it, which is great. So I think we'd like to show another clip at this point. This is Christopher Jackson as George Washington and Lin-Manuel Miranda as Hamilton. This is when Washington tells Hamilton that he is stepping down and not running for a second term. And the song is called One Last Time.
Like the scripture says, everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. They'll be safe in the nation we've made. I want to sit under my own vine and fig tree, a moment alone in the shade, at home in this nation we've made. One last time, one last time. Though in reviewing the incidents of my administration, I am unconscious of intentional error, I'm nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with an upright zeal, faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as I myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens, the benign influence of good laws under a free government, the ever-favorite object of my heart, and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. One last time. Teach them how to say goodbye.
would like to speak to that? I probably could give it a little more background about Hamilton writing Washington's speech. Maybe Mariah?
Well, yeah, I mean, the incredible thing about that song is that he uses the words of George Washington's actual farewell address and incorporates them into both the dialogue and the words of the song in an incredibly beautiful way, which is significant as a moment in the show, just as it was significant as a moment in our history. It was, you know, Washington telling Hamilton about how our country was going to have a peaceful transfer of power, which at that time was not something people could really imagine, as we find out a little bit later from King George. So, you know, it's, again, just an incredibly rich and layered collection of theatricality and musicianship and history and storytelling and character development that is incredible.
I don't really have much to say other than I think it's a really great song. It demonstrates to me, it's funny, when I watched it, the most recent time I watched the show, I began to really notice how sort of varied and distinctly different the music styles are throughout the show. You know, there's certain nods here and there to different styles of music. I've heard that the King's song is compared to sort of Britpop of the 60s and that sort of thing, and you can kind of hear that a little bit. So for me, I take a lot of enjoyment in being able to hear those and be able to kind of get a sense of what Miranda was doing with each of these songs and why he felt that that song could be mired in a specific kind of style. So it's just a beautiful performance. Christopher Jackson's amazing. So
yeah, that's for sure.
As a librarian and working with, you know, people of all ages, but particularly kids, do you have some suggestions for people who might like to delve in and learn a little bit more about the accuracies versus inaccuracies and where to go?
Oh my goodness, do I? So one of the things as a librarian, you know, when I saw this show, I immediately wanted to know way more than was necessary to enjoy it. And one of the first things that I went after was that Chernow biography that Miranda had used as his source material. But when I started reading it on my own, oh, it was so dense and there were so many details in it. And I was like, I need a better way to digest this. And so my colleague, Annie at the library, who is also a huge Hamilton fan, she pointed me in the direction of the Hamilcast podcast, which began very simply as two girls who were just big fans of the show. And their initial goal was to go through that biography chapter by chapter in each episode until they got through to the end. And discuss like what they thought about the history and how it compared to what was in the show. And it's fascinating. And then of course they went on to make hundreds of episodes and they had cast members on and all kinds of other wonderful things. So that's a wonderful listen if you have some time while you're, you know, cleaning, driving, whatever you're doing. It's a great listen. For kids, Melissa Dela Cruz made a great young adult series called Alex and Eliza. So if you're into the love story and you want to just dive into that, it's a great series for teens. I enjoyed reading it as well. And in terms of, you know, honesty and what's in the show and what's not and what's real and what isn't, you know, you don't have to go much further than Miranda's explanations of what is and is not true in the show. So this book is available from the library, so you don't have to go out and purchase it. It is fairly expensive on its own. But he writes all kinds of notes in the margins, line by line, scene by scene, what's real, what isn't, and why he made the choices that he made. So
that's great. Natalie, do you want to do a plug for Kent County Library to Go? I was so excited to read. We can start requesting books.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the newsletter just went out today for Library to Go service, and essentially we are now going to be able to process hold requests for items that are in our library, We had been waiting for a long time to get our books back in the building. They'd been in storage because of our renovations, but they're back. And so we can finally start doing some curbside service for what people may want to read or watch or anything else. So yeah, pretty exciting.
So great. I was going to suggest as another resource, both for the history but also for the music, is the website genius.com, which has annotated lyrics of every song in the show, and the comments on every part of it are just so absolutely thorough, and you can read kind of back and forth. Did they mean this? Did they mean that? How did this come together? You could spend your whole quarantine going through every line on that site, but it's really fascinating and gives so much background. So if you're interested in that, I would say that's a good place to look.
What is that website again?
Genius.com is the website, and that is, it started out as Rap Genius, where it would be annotations of rap lyrics, which much of Hamilton fits into that category, but it's now just called Genius.com, and you can find, the Hamilton ones are extremely thorough. Most of the music on that site is less quite kind of exhaustively annotated, but you can find almost any song, even if you're just looking for the lyrics. It's a good place to go. And some of the annotations are actually kind of approved or co-signed by Miranda himself, so you can get a little bit of that background information like what's in the book that Natalie was just showing us.
Well, time is flying right along, and so our last topic for the night, we'd like to talk about how Hamilton fits into the current national conversation on race. And so I think we're going to start this discussion by showing a clip. We're going to show Cabinet Battle number 3. And if you've seen the show, you're familiar with Cabinet Battle 1 and Cabinet Battle 2. Cabinet Battle 3 was cut. And so this may be the first time you're hearing of it. And we're going to show you the lyrics. And what you'll be hearing is Lin-Manuel Miranda. This is a demo recording, so all the voices are his, which Mariah explained to me earlier, and I was glad because I couldn't quite tell who everybody was. So we'll play that for you now.
The issue on the table. A petition from a Quaker delegation in Philadelphia calling on Congress to end the African slave trade and abolish slavery in all its forms. This petition was written and signed by Benjamin Franklin. It cannot go ignored. If this comes to a vote in Congress, what is the White House's position? Secretary Jefferson, you first. Tread lightly. Sir, the Constitution clearly states that the states have to wait until 1808 to debate on whether to end the slave trade. And whether or not you want it, guys, that is the final compromise we made. Sure, wait. But for a second, let us say that we can legislate unanimous emancipation. Freedom reigns, and yes, it's great. We cannot cure prejudice or righteous desperate hate. So back to Africa, or do they get a separate state? In 1784, I tried to float banning slavery in the West. My notion didn't get a single vote. Slavery's a sin, it's growing like a cancer. But we can't address a question if we do not have an answer. Is it my turn? Good. Plantation states are packed with promise makers. Do you realize the precious time these legislators wasted? Institutionalizing slavery only multiplies our troubles. Wait till the 1800s and the population doubles. You all know this is a stain on our soul and democracy, a land of the free. No, it's not. It's hypocrisy to subjugate, to humanize a race, call them property and say that we are powerless to stop it. You not foresee, sir, even you have hundreds of slaves whose descendants will curse our names when we're safe in our graves. How will the South find labor for its businesses? How will Thomas Jefferson find his next mistresses? How dare you? Still, people follow like lemmings. All you're hemming and hawing while you're hee-hawing with Sally Hemings. That's enough. Well, you asked how I feel. I don't pretend to know the answer, but the question is real. If I may, Mr. President Madison, let's take this moment to establish a precedent. First of all, sir, we won't involve you in this. Imagine this debate with all of Congress is ruinous. I'll reassure the South 1808 is still the year that was agreed upon. That buys us time and assuages fear. I'll tell the North that on January 1st of that year, we'll ban importation handling the worst. Once I get all this agreed upon, I'll pick up a pen and introduce a motion never to discuss this again. Mr. President, Hamilton, if we support emancipation, every single slave owner will demand compensation. And as for slandering Jefferson with talk of mistresses, do you really want to have that conversation? No. Madison, execute your plan to the letter. Let's hope the next generation thinks of something better.
Steve, would you like to get us started with this conversation? I think you had an idea to share.
Yeah, I did. I was as the Disney Plus production was getting ready to go on, and as I was sort of gearing up for getting a chance to really get a good look at it, I started doing a little bit of research, started looking around at various other things. One of the things I fell across was a SiriusXM Zoom reunion get-together of many of the prominent members of the cast in preparation for this opening performance on the 3rd of July. And in it, Lin-Manuel Miranda had something interesting to say that I think is a really good introduction for us to start talking about race as a potential discussion on Hamilton. So here's what he said. He said, "I'm humbled and grateful when I see history has its eyes on you, on placards at a Black Lives Matter rally or the protests." But then he also said, the thing that about Hamilton is that there's just so much in it, that different things hit differently depending upon where we're at in the conversation. The show hits differently during the Trump era than it did in the Obama era. The lyrics on slavery and what these people, meaning the founders, what they did and what they didn't do, their silence hits differently now than it did, now that we're having these conversations and having this massively overdue conversation on systemic racism. Because it brushes up against the origin of the country, there's always something that pops out of it. So what he's saying, essentially, I think it sort of speaks for itself a little bit, but that he's trying to suggest that themes will alternately become more important than others, but depending upon what's going on in the country, and that he believes that he has, that the material then can sort of be pulled from to speak to those things because it touches on so many things within it. He also implied, though, that in the statement, that there's a recognition that we all have at this time, that while our founders had this immense job of creating a nation, that there was obvious failure, and that they knew it was seriously imperfect, and they didn't give freedom and equality to everyone in this amazingly huge task that they set out to do. It's not the first time that argument has been made in regard to the founding fathers, having been in and directed a production of 1776 in the past, and this massively huge important song called Molasses to Rum talks about the hypocrisy of Northerners who criticized the Southerners because the Northerners' ships were what were bringing the slaves back to the colonies. That conversation was there. Abolitionists of the era were having those discussions, but they had so much work to do that they failed in that regard. And I think that his statement is an interesting way to sort of start that conversation now, tonight about it amongst us.
I particularly resonated with that notion of things hitting differently at different times. I can recall when I first heard the music of Hamilton, that line about immigrants, we get the job done, was very sort of tongue-in-cheek and funny. And then when I went to see the live production, the reaction of the crowd to that line was very different. Nobody was laughing. It was like this cheer, this call to action. It was almost aggressive. And it paused the show for a couple of seconds because it was that important in that moment. At that time, we were having a lot of controversy in the country over new immigration laws, DACA issues. I mean, it was intense, to say the least.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you think about the very beginning of the show, you know, when Miranda started writing it in 2008, Obama had just become president, and so that was kind of one moment, and it wasn't really public then, but there were some public parts, and then Obama became president right around the same time that the show opened, and so that was another environment to come at this show. You know, you walk in off the street into the theater and you're coming out of something, right? And so that was another kind of thing. And when Trump became president, that became another environment the show was kind of situated in. And for some reason, you know, because it's about our country and because of the way that it really takes on some of the questions that people have about how we got where we are and how we're going to get to the next place. You don't really leave the world behind when you go in to see the show, I think, in the same way. And that question, you know, I remember when it was first opening, the question of the casting was huge. I mean, nobody could get over it. Nobody could get over the fact that, you know, Christopher Jackson, a black man, was playing George Washington, and that all the people on the stage who were playing the people on our money were people of color. And I remember very early on having a conversation with someone. I was up in Massachusetts at that time, and I had dinner next to, you know, some older, sort of very well-heeled white woman, and we were talking about the show. It was just getting so much buzz that everybody was talking about it. And I remember she said to me, "I just don't know if that casting can work. I don't think you could ever really believe those characters." I remember just sort of like, I didn't know what to say, but what that tells me today is how absolutely how much of an impact the show has had, because we don't think twice now. I mean, there are kids who have never not known that a black person could portray George Washington. So, you know, it is so interesting. And then to have kind of entered into this era that we're in now, where, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests are really sweeping not just our country, but the world in a way that, you know, I wasn't around in the 60s, but what I am hearing and reading is that this is at least as big a moment as that was. And the show does hit differently now. I mean, it does feel like, why are we admiring Jefferson? You know, why are we giving these guys a pass now? It's really interesting. But I do think that throughout the show, from the very, I mean, you know, slavery is in the third line of the show. And all the way to the very end, you know, you can see during that very last song, George Washington up on the balcony at the back of the stage, and he reacts to the line, you know, something about I fought against slavery. And it is woven within every part of the show, and I think it's not always explicit. And I think maybe today that feels less important than it did 5 years ago. I think 5 years ago it felt more significant, and that's great. I mean, that's progress, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. A black man playing Washington, and the initial understanding that people had about that idea. Well, what are they railing against? They're railing against the idea that a black man could become president, and then we had Obama. But that's can be looked at sort of in two different perspectives. For me, it's like, well, yes, of course. But on the other hand, I'm also saying, well, what took us so long? You know, that we had to reach this far in the history of this country before we could start to see equality at that highest level of leadership, of position. So it's I think that it points out incidentally and also within the context of the play, both the sort of the social injustice of the way that that the conversation on equalities occurred in this country, but it also, in its own way, teaches us a little bit, especially with conversations like that about Washington's casting, that there's still, even amidst all of the tension that exists in the country today, there's still work to be done. So it's very interesting that a piece of theater could teach us all this.
I think it does an amazing job of eliminating that distance between us and that part of history. Because these themes, these topics, the issue of race, the issue of slavery, we're still talking about it today. It's still our present. And to believe that somehow this, hundreds years old piece of history is no longer relevant or applicable to what's happening today in our country, it just threw down all of those barriers.
Well, believe it or not, we've gone for just about an hour. I'm wondering if there are any final thoughts that each of you have before we wrap up for the evening.
I have one, actually. I want to say, Mariah, Ann, you'll probably know that the conversation about this program started with Megan Furster, my development director. So I want to give a shout out to her. We're having this conversation because she was very passionate about the idea. She's very passionate, just as I am, about partnerships in general, but specifically about this one. So good for her. Nic, as always, I want to give a shout out to him because he works very, very hard and is usually on top of things so well that we don't even know he's doing it. So it's fantastic. And, the Garfield staff is always very supportive in GCTV's efforts. Since I'm on camera and I get the chance to give these shout outs, I'm going to, because I'm rarely on camera for GCTV. But also, I just want to say thank you to Francoise Sullivan, who runs Moo Productions. She does a lot of our marketing and our publicity stuff. And she is just absolutely incredible and very supportive and excellent at what she does. So thank you to her. Thanks to all of you for participating. That's my closing comments, but I want to give you all a chance to talk too.
So as someone who works for the public library, access is extremely important in my field. And I would like to say that, this show has provided such a unique opportunity for access because it is now available to watch in your own home. Broadway musical theater in general tends to be a high price point for most people, something that they can't ever really get to experience on a regular basis, if ever. So again, this show is making strides in making the arts accessible, which is what community theater is all about in the first place.
That is a perfect segue into what I want to say, Natalie, which is that, in my role at RiverArts, we talk so much all the time about making arts accessible, of arts of all kinds, and I agree that's what this show has done to an extent that is not sufficient or hasn't been sufficient, at least until now, because it was hard to go see. We all know that, but they have put a lot of thought into it, and that too is a piece of progress, and they've affected the whole rest of the theater world through that. And I really want to thank the Garfield for doing the same thing right here in Chestertown. I mean, thank you, first of all, for letting us kind of piggyback in and be part of GCTV. And in this very weird world of pandemic, and, theaters especially are just so devastatingly impacted. And you guys have been doing such a great job of keeping it going, keeping us all in the community involved. And I think, for me from the beginning, it's been so important to make those connections and have those partnerships, because I feel like this is hard times and we're not going to make it unless we do it together. So I really appreciate that. I love this collaboration. I hope that we can do more of it. And I really want to thank Ann for being incredible moderator and helping us get through this really fun hour. And Natalie and Steve, thank you for being great conversation partners. This was really fun. I could do it for another 2 hours, but I won't make everybody sit through that.
We've had a lot of fun doing this tonight.
And everybody support the arts.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, we appreciate everybody who's watching. If you'll consider supporting all of the organizations represented here, they're really an important part of Chestertown, and we thank you for spending your time with us tonight, and thanks for being in the room where it happens with us. Good night.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us for a very special presentation of GCTV. Come back and join us next week. We'll be right here. We have a musical selection next week, and there will be more info about that upcoming on our Facebook page. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here tonight, we ask that you please consider donating to the Garfield Center for the Arts by visiting garfieldcenter.org/donate/. Thanks. Night.